Hello again. This is Father David Archibald at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, San Antonio, Texas, and you're listening to a class that will discuss the essential story of Christianity. I use it as a preparation for students who would like to be initiated into the Christian faith in baptism, and as a class for renewing an old faith. That's why this class is called Initiate and Renew. The series has 9 parts. The first class is an introduction discussing the difficulties around telling this ancient, essential story in the context of the modern world. And this is the second class. And here we will tell the whole story in one section, in a bare bones fashion. It's told as a story with no reference to the Bible and no reference to the church or any other external authority. The story will ring true, or at least be an intriguing possibility on its own merit. Then in the following classes, the following 7 classes, lectures numbers 3 through 9, we will add back in the scripture and tradition so that those sources can be read through the lenses of the transformation of consciousness, which is the essential story of Christianity as I tell it. This will make many of those texts and those sources much more interesting and understandable. Now, one storytelling culture used to say, as they began to tell a story, "I don't know if this really happened, but I know it's true." That's the power of myth, that's the power of story, to communicate something more than the historical facts, but something that is true at a much deeper level. So let's tell this story and see if it sounds true to us. In the beginning, or the beginning of the game, God is the source of a multi-dimensional universe. This is really the title to the first chapter of the story, and in much simpler language we could just say that there is more to the universe than meets the eye, even when that eye is aided by technology. For sacred tradition tells this story that all things have come from one source. That source is sometimes given the name God, but we must be very careful not to believe too hard in any particular image or any particular name for God. So put bluntly, the source is formless and outside of time. And naturally, the temptation with the word God is to associate it with pronouns like he or she, and imagine this entity as a rather literal person like a mother or father or a king, or something in the human roles like a lawgiver or a judge or a warrior. But remember, God is outside of time and formless. And while metaphors can be used devotionally and in our conversation, we must keep in mind that this source is pure consciousness and unmanifested energy. So it doesn't really have a name or a label. When this energy flows, or more poetically, overflows, as if it were wine overflowing a cup, then a great chain of being is born and existence begins. The first few links of this chain of being are not visible to the senses, and those beings from those realms are not material, You could use the word spirits here if it helps you imagine the concept. And later down the chain of being, the tangible, physical universe is created. At this level, you might imagine the Big Bang Theory, when the physical universe begins. Now, following the metaphor on the slide, just as a snowball rolling down a hill picks up items over which it passes over time on its journey to the bottom, so each new being created at each level picks up and retains something of that realm that was before it and above it. And we are the snowballs at the bottom of the hill. And we are made not only of just physical form, but of the essence of those other dimensions of reality which preceded us and from which we came, beginning with the source itself. The universe then has multiple dimensions, beginning with the source, followed by a hierarchy of dimensions and realities which are beyond the five senses, and ending with the material universe and humans on this planet Earth, which of course we do know with our senses. Taken as a whole, those unseen realities are what we call spiritual, and the physical ones we call the material realms and dimensions. So the story tells us that the creation, including both the spiritual and the material dimensions, it was not a mistake. As some religious doctrine might tell you, nor was creation an accident of random acts of physics and genetics, even as it may appear that way from some viewpoints in the Western scientific point of view. No, the story says instead creation is the manifestation of divine consciousness and energy into form for the purpose of the joyful reflection of God in form. All things and all life exists to simply show forth the divine goodness, beauty, and love in a tremendous variety of forms. The Source, or God, wants to or desires to express itself in form. Spiritual masters of all religious traditions, including Christianity, speak of this multidimensional nature of reality and of the human's ability and destiny to know all those realms. In fact, if one did not know the spiritual realm, in addition to the physical one outside our bodies, as far as religion is concerned, you would not be fully alive or fully human. So humans, it turns out, are multidimensional creatures living in a multidimensional universe. We are capable of being conscious of all the realms of reality, and to not know them and to know the source from which we came means that we are diminished, and we often feel like a part of us is missing. And no matter how much we achieve on the external level, no matter how much we know about the physical universe, there is a constant craving we often feel that's not satisfied. We are not at ease. We feel like something is not enough. Sometimes we even feel as if we are exiled from our homeland. And so, we can physically be aware of our five senses. That comes through the body. We can be mentally aware of ourselves and have a psychological awareness. And we can also be spiritually aware of the unseen dimensions, which is ultimately our origin. That we are made up of body, mind, and spirit is a critical part of the ancient and traditional story. We are more complex than the purely scientific worldview presents. We are multidimensional beings in a multidimensional universe. If we grow in our awareness of the spiritual realms, we will be complete and also attain those qualities which have been traditionally associated with God. This is truly a step beyond where evolution has taken most of us so far. Because most humans are unaware of the spiritual dimensions of life, and this is the crux of the problem of the human condition. The issue of our humanity is not that our minds are undeveloped and that we need to create more time-saving and life-saving technology. No, the issue is that we need to go beyond the mind to a new level of consciousness and become a new kind of human being. For a while, we are spiritually unborn or immature, or that aspect of ourselves is hidden or forgotten. They do remain inside of us in potential. If we remain in that state of being unconscious of our spiritual nature, we will remain out of balance and create much suffering in the world, regardless of how cleverly we advance with science and technology. So we are created and we are actually designed, and it's our destiny as both physical and spiritual beings to be a new kind of creation. A metaphor for being multidimensional creatures is that we live along a horizontal axis through time and space, and simultaneously live along a vertical axis, conscious of the timeless and spiritual dimensions. Some people would say we are like a frog, that we live in two worlds at once. That's the more colorful metaphor for being connected vertically to the spiritual dimensions and also horizontally in space and time. We're like amphibians, living in both the water and the land. So we are meant to live both physical and in both physical and spiritual worlds. It's our primary purpose in life to become consistently conscious of our spiritual nature and our spiritual origins in this world, and then to show forth the beauty of the one God and the one source in form here in time and space. Now, becoming spiritually conscious, that is each one of our personal tasks in life. And this becomes our spiritual journey. To make the transition in consciousness, for most people that's a growth process. We are increasing in awareness. We first begin aware that we possess a body, and then next we possess and have an ego or a created self-image, moving from the unconscious to the self-conscious. But ultimately, we must come to know ourselves essentially as one with Spirit. That is the transition into God consciousness. So as you follow along the circle on the PowerPoint presentation, we begin unconscious in infancy as babies. We gradually move into self-consciousness in our teenage years as adolescents. And then there is the potential in adulthood to move into God consciousness. Has anyone really done this transformation? Is there any guide or help or roadmap? Of course, in the Christian tradition, Jesus is the one. He is the revelation to the world of a God-conscious person. He taught the way to God consciousness. He lived the way of God consciousness. And the energy of his presence helps his followers become God consciousness. He is like the catalyst that helps them awaken and come to know their own connection with the source and who they are in God. The spiritual dimension is a reality for Jesus. For as the story is told, the Spirit descends on him like a dove, quote unquote, and even greater than the Jewish spirit people before him, like the prophets, he has come to know God as his source, to know himself as the beloved Son of God, the very offspring of the one source. He lives in touch with the vertical dimension of life, and at the same time lives on the horizontal plane as well. Keeping with our metaphor from earlier, Jesus is the amphibian, like the frog. But that sounds not too religious. But he is truly a whole person, both divine and human. He has a body, he has a mind, and he is connected to God through spirit. From the time he was baptized, he became a transformer of people. He exposes his followers and his disciples to a higher way of life, and he enables them to begin to know the source of their own being and experience the Spirit in themselves just as he does. He is like the pioneer, the first one to explore this new level of consciousness and this new creation that he begins. Then his students, they've been called to follow him into this new world and become like the teacher. Spiritual consciousness spreads from person to person. Something like fire spreads from one fuel source to the next. Little is known of his journey to spiritual awakening, but for those who are ready, for those who have suffered enough in their limited identity as creatures cut off from spirit, well, they too can undergo the awakening and the spiritual transformation. Their interior candle can be lit from the light of his life. So for those who are called to be a disciple of Jesus, our primary goal, more important than any individual goal of careers or family or all the rest, is to make the transformation of consciousness from an ordinary, egoic human being to a transformed spiritual human being with Jesus as our model, guide, and teacher. And then with this new center, we live with a new power, and we will manifest spirit through our own unique lives. The inward transformation will create the outer transformation. No matter what we do outwardly, we must remain centered in God consciousness. The one thing we are responsible for, sometimes the only thing we can control, is our state of consciousness. Then as the power of Spirit is increasingly manifest in our lives, we become co-creators with God, or put another way, we in our human form become incarnations of the Spirit. we become part of the solution to egoic consciousness as God-conscious members of a new humanity. There's no special spiritual gifts needed for us to simply reflect and carry the divine consciousness into our relationships, into our vocations, into our many changing roles in the family, and into the societies that we create. Everything we do becomes sacred. Everything becomes worship as we see God in all things, and everything becomes a spiritual practice as we try to maintain spiritual consciousness moment by moment. On this journey we take of gradually coming to know ourselves as beings in union with God and rooted in the spiritual dimension, it is not without difficulties. We can imagine challenges coming to us from at least three places: from within us, from society around us, and perhaps even from the spiritual world above us. We have our own demons within due to our psychological conditioning, and the ego naturally desires to remain dominant. That's our challenge from within. But also society around us will usually not encourage but discourage spiritual progress. And there are many external structures in the world that are harmful to us. And it's even possible for beings or entities from the unseen spiritual dimensions along the vertical axis to create challenges for us as well. Yet Jesus has led the way. He has overcome all three types of obstacles in himself, and he shows us how we can do the same. Ultimately, nothing within, without, or above is more powerful than God's presence, which, whether we know it or not, is the core of our being. Now, if the beginning game was that we all have come from the one source, what does the end game look like? What are we destined for as individuals, and where is creation heading? Anywhere in particular? Or is history just going to repeat itself endlessly? The end game for individuals will be this: we will return to the formless dimensions and to the source from which we came. We are, in our essence, eternal. And the eternal life is not something we gain. It is a grace. It is a gift, part of our natural being. As Jesus has led the way as spiritual being in physical form, so we have him leading the way out of this physical form and back into the dimension from which he came. We are passing through this life of material form, and we will eventually return back to the other stages of spiritual form from which we came. While we are here, we live as the beachhead and the beginning of a new world order. Yet, even when we have come to fullness of life here in this world will not be a utopia that's free from challenges. God-conscious people will still grow old and die. God-conscious people will not be immune from accidents. We will not be protected from natural disasters. And suffering caused by those who are still in the old egoic stage will be problematic. However, knowing their spiritual nature while we are here in this transitory and chance-filled world will allow God-conscious people to know peace and joy of their inner life, even while the outer life is always going to be challenging. Our essence is eternal and survives once this physical body is not able to be a vehicle or expression for God. Now, the end game, not for individuals but for this planet, is that there will be a new earth and a new creation when God consciousness becomes the norm for human beings. The change that has happened within human beings will be reflected in the world we create. Man-made suffering, which is by far the greater portion of suffering in our world, will come to an end. No one will harm another intentionally, for they will see all others as part of themselves, all of us originating from the one source and part of the one source. So we've just told now the essential story of the transformation of consciousness. It assumes that we live in a multidimensional universe as multidimensional creatures, and we exist at the end of a great chain of being. And at the end of the line, we have forgotten or lost contact with our spiritual essence. So it's our task here to recollect our true selves by means of following one like Jesus, and through his teaching, his whole life, and his ongoing presence, we engage in the transformation of consciousness. It is truly a journey with obstacles along the way, but in the end, nothing can separate us from God. As we grow in God consciousness, it means spiritual transformation in this life, discovering for ourselves heaven while we are on earth. It means the temporary creation of an impermanent but lovely and just society in this world. Finally, it means the return journey outside of this material form, eventually back to the source from which all things flow. The world in Jesus' time was not receptive to his new way of seeing or of his life, and his followers today may also find the world is not very receptive to their new way of life. They killed him for his teaching and for his life, which upset both the religious and the social world. Today's world is also still mostly bound in egoic consciousness and will be challenging in the same ways to new spiritual people, like the disciples of Jesus. But perhaps you are willing and even called to follow his way. It is the way of true life, the way of true peace, the way of true joy. In the upcoming presentations, we will go deeper into this story that I've just told you. And we will add back in some of the biblical and Christian language which we have intentionally avoided for the sake of clarity. So thank you for listening to this vision of the story of the good news of Christianity, the story of the transformation of consciousness.